In this video, I'm going to show you how to work the buttonholes for the Ice Cream Party Cardi. So once you've made it all the way back around to the flat part of the front panel, you're going to repeat rows 1 and 2 of the applied slip stitch ribbing 2 more times for size 2, and maybe more if you're working a different size. So once you've done those repeats, we're ready to work a buttonhole. So chain 1 and turn, and you're going to work a slip stitch in the back loop only of the first 2 slip stitches. And then you're going to chain 2, you're going to skip 2 slip stitches and slip stitch in the next 2 slip stitches in the back loop only. And then you're going to slip stitch 2 into the front panel like you have been, making sure you're still doing the evenly spacing of spacing 3 crochet ribbing rows for every 2 half double crochet row ends. When you're ready to work the next row, what you're going to do is you're going to skip the first 2 slip stitches that you just finished, and then you're going to slip stitch into the next 2 slip stitches. So skip the first 2, slip stitch in the next 2 in the back loop only. And then when you get back to the buttonhole, we're going to place 2 single crochets inside that chain 2 space. And then you're going to slip stitch in the back loop only of the next 2 slip stitches. And that is how you work the buttonhole rows. So you're going to continue repeating the applied slip stitch ribbing 1 and 2 rows until you get to the point that you want to put your next buttonhole. So you're going to be evenly spacing these buttonhole rows out along the rest of the front of the cardigan. And for size 2, that's going to be about every 6 ribbing rows, and it's going to be more for larger sizes. One thing that I like to do to make sure my buttonholes are evenly spaced is I like to use locking stitch markers to mark out where I'd like them to go in advance. So you can place a marker right where you put your first buttonhole, and then evenly space out the remaining buttonholes. So this cardigan has 6 buttonholes. You can modify it to put however many buttons or buttonholes you would prefer. So I'm going to put the next one at the bottom and then start splitting the spaces from there. And since this cardigan does have an even number of buttons, there won't be one directly in the middle. So I'm going to go a little above, I'm going to find the middle and then go a little bit above it and place a marker. And do my best to kind of eyeball them all spaced out. And once you've got them all in place, you can kind of make adjustments from there, evenly spacing them. And this is just going to help you stay on track if for whatever reason you're not evenly spacing your slip stitching rows. Because it should end up being about every 6 rows. For every 6 rows you work a buttonhole row. The 2 buttonhole rows, and then 6 more rows, and then a buttonhole row. Or it'll be more than 6 rows for larger sizes. Just follow along with the pattern. So go ahead and continue working your buttonholes until you've finished, and we'll move on to the buttons. So I worked the rest of my buttonholes, and now it's time to sew the buttons onto the other side. And one thing I like to do to make sure the buttons are lined up with the buttonholes is I make sure the 2 front pieces are overlapping the way that I want them to, and then I use a locking stitch marker to go through that buttonhole and grab that other ribbing through the back, the ribbing on the side we're going to be sewing the buttons to. And I do that all the way down the front of the cardigan for each buttonhole row. And once you've done it for every hole, you can just open up the cardigan and your stitch markers should be in place on your right front panel there where we're going to be sewing our buttons. So I've got my 3/4 of an inch button here, and a sewing needle and some coordinating thread. I'm going to show you how I sew on my buttons, but definitely it's not the most professional way. It's a mix of what I've found works well for me. So I'll link to a more proper tutorial on how to sew buttons, but I'll also demonstrate how I do it. So I'm threading my sewing needle here. And because I tend to buy cheap thread at times, I'm going to double up the thickness of my thread for durability. Sometimes the cheaper cotton threads snap pretty easily. So with my yarn doubled up, I'm going to put some knots in the end of it to secure it in place. It helps the doubled up threads from tangling, and it also gives a little bit of resistance when you start seaming. So I'm ready to sew on my first button here. I'm going to remove that marker and lay the button over top. You want to make sure you don't put the button too close to the edge of your front panel. So I come up from the bottom just to the point where I hit that resistance knot. Don't pull too hard because you will pull it all the way through. It's not a knot that will really hold it in place, just enough to give you some resistance to tell you to stop. So I go down and back up, making sure the thread is coming through properly. You might have to pull on that tail end a bit to snug it up. And then I come back down one more time. And this time when I come up, I'm not going to go up through the button. I'm going to come up through the fabric, but behind the button where I would go through the hole, but I'm not going to go through the hole. I'm going to come up in between the fabric and the button. I'm going to pull it tight. And then I'm going to wind that thread around the button a couple times, nice and tightly. And then pull it real nice and snug. And then I come back up through the button, like we should have done in the first place before we did our wraparounds. So I come back up through the button, and then back down. And then I do that one more time, just coming back up. And at this point, I just pull on both ends of the thread here and check to see that the button's nice and properly secured and tight. And then I'm gonna sew this end in by making tiny stitches through the fabric, just going up and down, up and down. Think of it like if you were using a sewing machine. If you sew in the same place over and over and over again, you get this impenetrable thickness of thread that does not want to come out. So that's kind of what you're doing with your needle. After going back and forth a couple times, not in exactly the same place, but close to the same place, I then knot my two ends together. This is just an extra step that's probably unnecessary, but it makes me feel better about the way the buttons are secured. I just overhand knot them together twice. And then you can snip the ends. A little bit closer than that. And then you should barely have any thread showing on the inside, especially if you used coordinating thread, and you should have a nice and secured button. So I went ahead and repeated that for the rest of the buttons, and this is what your cardigan should look like. Congratulations on your Ice Cream Party Cardi! If you make this pattern, definitely tag me on social media. You can use the @Mandobug, #Ice Cream Party Cardi. I love seeing your guys' finished objects using my patterns. And until next time, guys, happy crafting!